Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to welcome you this afternoon's Policy Forum panel conversation at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. My name is Soner Çağatay. I'm a Senior Fellow here and Director of the Turkish Research Program, and I'm very happy to see a lot of familiar faces around the room to join this discussion with this panel on U.S.-Turkish relationship and an historic period in the relationship marked by a war of sanctions, mutual sanctions. This event is on the record. You can tweet, put it on social media, but please turn your phones off because we have C-SPAN, another TV, live streaming the event. It's also on live stream on our website, and I want to welcome everybody who's joining us online to this afternoon's important conversation on what lies ahead for the U.S.-Turkey relationship. We put together a great panel for you. They've changed their seating order. I'm going to go from my immediate left. My friend Stephen Cook is an Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at Council on Foreign Relations, former Institute alumni. Stephen is an expert on Arab and Turkish politics. His most recent book, The Struggle for Egypt, From Nasser to Tahrir Square, won the Institute's, that is the Washington Institute's, Book Award Gold Medal in 2012.
Not my most recent book, but thank you for mentioning The Struggle.
His most important works have followed. Right, there you go. Amanda Sloat, going next, is another good friend, Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in the Center for United States and Europe at Brookings Institute, and her areas of expertise include Turkey and Southern Europe. She's served for nearly 10 years in U.S. government. She was previously Deputy Assistant Secretary for Southern European and Eastern Mediterranean Affairs, where she covered U.S. relations with Cyprus, Greece, and Turkey. She holds a doctorate in politics from University of Edinburgh, and she's a fellow yogi, which is very important. Max Hoffman, finally concluding, is another alumni of University of Edinburgh. Today is the trend. He has a master's degree from the same institution, so we're greeting University of Edinburgh from here. Max is an Associate Director of National Security and International Policy at American Center for American Progress, focusing on Turkey and Kurdish issues. He has worked on disarmament and security issues as well at the United Nations and U.S. House of Representatives Armed Service Committee. And another good friend, another good analyst joining us. So I'm very grateful that we're able to put this panel together. When we set it up nearly 2 weeks ago, there were no sanctions. They had not been implemented, but could kind of see that this was not an usual period in the relationship. And I think what we have seen, and I'm going to ask my colleagues to weigh in before I pick up the floor and open the floor to questions, is an unusual period in the relationship in the sense that while tensions existed between U.S. and Turkish bureaucracies for a while now over a variety of issues, the crisis has for the first time escalated to a presidential level between the two countries. That's unique, that's different. So the issue is, what are the pitfalls, what are the prospects to manage it going forward, to prevent further crises. I think the panel is going to present you a very diverse view of opinions. So we're going to start with Amanda, sitting in the middle, move on to Max, and Steve will conclude. I'll then ask the panelists to reflect on each other's points before opening the floor to questions. Once again, this is on the record, tweet, and put on social media as much as you like, and looking forward to a great conversation. Amanda?
I thank you, Soner, for the invitation, and to all of you who are coming. There's lots of seats in the front row if people are hovering in the back and want to move closer to heckle. There are seats available. What I thought would be helpful is to provide a little bit of historical context to this, because I think the current dispute over the imprisonment of Andrew Brunson is really the immediate flashpoint, but it comes at the end of a period of growing tensions between the two countries. And certainly we've seen over the last couple of years, including during the time when I was in government, that both countries have developed lists of grievances against one another. From the Turkish perspective, there's been a sense that the U.S. has not taken seriously their security concerns. And they would point to two things. One is American cooperation with the YPG in Syria, given its links to the PKK. And the second is the U.S. refusal to extradite Fethullah Gulen, who they, of course, blame as being responsible for the July 2016 coup attempt. On the U.S. side, there's been increasing questions about whether or not Turkey is a reliable ally. And again, this has two components. The first relates to Turkey's plans to buy the S-400 missile defense system from Russia, which would not be compatible with NATO systems. and also is seen as being threatening to the security of the F-35 stealth fighter jets that the U.S. plans to sell to Turkey as part of a broader European consortium. And the second is the decline in rule of law, particularly in the wake of the coup attempt, including what has been Erdogan's recent practice of engaging in hostage diplomacy with the imprisonment of several Americans, including some dual nationals, as well as 3 Turkish employees of U.S. consulates. The administration really, I think, made concerted efforts over the last year to try and find diplomatic ways of resolving these conflicts. It was quite striking if you look at 1 week in February 2018, where you had engagement by the American Defense Secretary, Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor with their Turkish counterparts all at the same time. Coming out of then Secretary of State Tillerson's visit to Turkey was the creation of several working groups, which were meant to be a way of resolving a lot of these issues. And I think from the American perspective, they went a long way to try and address some of these Turkish irritants. On the Syria side, there was the development of this Manbij roadmap, which was an effort to try and remove some of the YPG forces from Manbij, as had been promised to the Turks in the previous administration. Charges were dropped against 11 of the 17 bodyguards of Erdogan who were involved in the Sheridan Circle incident during Erdogan's May visit here last year. And Çavuşoğlu also announced in June, following his meeting with Secretary Pompeo, that Pompeo had told him that the FBI was opening investigations into Gulenist organizations in the U.S. So I think there was a feeling on the U.S. side that they had done quite a bit to try and address Turkish concerns. During the same period, you had growing frustration within Congress about a lot of these same issues with Turkey, and there really was a strong desire on the Hill to start imposing punitive measures on Turkey, and various legislative measures had been introduced. Some of these were held back because the administration had been saying to the Hill that they had these new diplomatic channels and they wanted to find a way to resolve these conflicts through those efforts. You also had in July Senators Shaheen and Graham going to Turkey and engaging with Erdogan personally to try and resolve some of these disputes. So what has been striking, certainly 2 weeks ago, is that you actually had a moving together of the positions of both the executive and legislative branches in terms of frustration with Turkey, a feeling that diplomatic efforts were not working, and a willingness for the first time to use economic measures against Turkey as a way of achieving some of these policy objectives. I think what we've seen in the last week or two has been a new phase of this, which is the White House actually going out and taking a much harder line than what Congress had even been anticipating, and perhaps what others within the administration were looking to do. The question is whether or not this very strong approach by the White House, particularly using the global Magnitsky sanctions, which initially had been developed to deal with Russian human rights abuses, and even in the Russia case were used on lower level officials, starting with using those against senior cabinet members of Erdogan's government. And then the steel and aluminum tariffs, which has been a tool that Erdogan has been using against European and Canadian allies, is actually going to be a way to achieve the results that we're wanting to see, or whether they end up backing Erdogan into such a corner that it becomes a little bit more difficult to try and find a diplomatic off-ramp. One thing that I think has become very clear in the last week or two is that this issue is now extremely personal for Trump, and I think it's quite clear that Trump is prepared to impose additional economic measures until he achieves his policy goal, which is seeing Andrew Brunson back on U.S. soil. So then the question becomes how much economic pain Erdogan is prepared to withstand while the U.S. continues to apply economic pressure to achieve these measures. Even if the Brunson issue is solved, we still have this outstanding question of Russia with the NDAA having passed in Congress, which puts limits on the potential transfer of the F-35s if the Russian sale goes ahead. And there is also pending legislation in the Senate which would ask the United States to restrict loans from international financial institutions from being provided to Turkey. So there's certainly plenty of additional levers that can be used by the administration in furtherance of this policy objective. Separate even from those, I think there's a couple of additional flashpoints that will be worth watching for. One is certainly in Syria. We have the potential for military operations in Idlib, which have the potential of increasing large numbers of refugees coming into Turkey, and also, interestingly, will end up really pitting Turkey and Russia on either side of the Syrian conflict. And on the Iran issue more broadly, it's very clear that the Erdogan administration is interested in the handling of the Halk Bank case, as as well as potential conflict if the Trump administration continues to impose its zero imports policy with the snapback of those sanctions in November, which is going to be practically difficult for Turkey given its lack of viable alternatives. Last thing I'll say is Erdoğan has certainly been speaking a lot publicly about his ability to have friends and allies in other places. It was a very clear theme of his New York Times op-ed last week. I remain a little bit skeptical about how strong and enduring some of those alternative relations have the potential for being. Certainly, we saw the $15 billion loan from Qatar yesterday, which seems to have helped stabilize the Turkish economy to a certain extent. The other biggest opportunity for him in Russia, I think, is going to be complicated. Erdoğan spoke to Putin last week. Foreign Minister Lavrov was in Turkey this week. But it's worth remembering it was less than 3 years ago that we saw a serious crisis in Turkish-Russian relations following Turkey's shoot-down of the Russian jet that had violated its airspace, leading to sanctions being imposed by Russia on Turkey, as well as the eventual apology by Erdoğan. The thing that's been the most striking is what seems to be Erdoğan's charm offensive and diplomatic outreach to Europe to at least try and salvage some of his relationships with Western partners in the face of these deteriorating relations with the U.S. It was a welcome development to see the release of the 2 Greek soldiers earlier this week, as well as Taner Kilic, the head of Amnesty International in Turkey, as well as a renewal of diplomatic ties with the Netherlands and certainly continued outreach to improve relations with Germany. So I will leave it there.
Thanks so much. Max, you're next.
Sure. Well, I think what we've seen over the last 2 weeks in Turkey is the sort of culmination of a long-running crisis of authoritarianism. If you think about the long-term and short-term trends that are, devastating the Turkish economy and are applying such tremendous pressure on U.S.-Turkish relations, they all track back to this crisis of authoritarianism. The central bank has no independence to raise interest rates, which would, of course, alleviate the immediate pressure on the Turkish lira and on the Turkish economy. It would not address the more deep-rooted problems in the Turkish economy, which have to do with the need for fundamental reform and the need to sort of invest in higher technology, higher value-added exports that the AKP government has sort of allowed to fall by the wayside over the last 5, 6, 7 years. But raising interest rates could buy them time. They can't do that, and that's because Erdoğan has consolidated total control in his own hands, and he knows that raising interest rates would fatally undermine the AKP's credit-fueled sort of growth agenda. Although growth should be in air quotes because it's undermined entirely by high inflation, and the AKP's domestic legitimacy is built in large part on this credit-fueled, construction-fueled growth that we've seen for a decade, but which is now running dry. Politically, it's crucial to Erdoğan. Also, beyond the sort of general political legitimacy, this popularity he derives from this economic growth in a more fundamental way, which is that the AKP has built an extensive patronage system based, dating back to the 90s, in fact, when Erdoğan was the mayor of Istanbul. Based on the awarding of construction permits, as millions of Turks moved to the cities, these high-rises sprung up. These permits were handed out by Erdoğan and his cronies. They were used to accumulate political power. They were used to, siphon off huge amounts of money, as we've seen over the last 5 years emerge in increasingly stark terms. And they built a huge patronage system that really allows them to wield tremendous power and motivate voters, deliver services to their neighborhoods while neglecting other neighborhoods. And Erdoğan knows that these debts are starting to come due, that the end of this road is in sight, but he has completely consolidated power and will do his utmost to defend this new elite that he's helped build. Of course, more broadly, what foreign investor would want to invest in Turkey these days when there's no rule of law? You can have no hope that you'd compete fairly for state contracts. You can have little hope that you'll get fair legal redress through the judicial system because the judicial system is entirely politicized. Erdoğan, of course, has formally taken control of huge numbers of judicial appointments, but informally, even before the constitutional referendum and, of course, the recent presidential and parliamentary elections, he wielded almost total control over judicial appointments. And then this formal shift to the new system means that the old institutions that used to moderate the actions of Erdoğan and previous Turkish leaders are completely neutered. You think particularly in terms of foreign relations of the military and the foreign ministry. But domestically, the same rule holds. Erdoğan is now untethered. He's, all power is in his personal hands. The bureaucracy is completely sidelined. So there's nothing to prevent him from acting on his personal views. And some of those views are quite bizarre, particularly on the economic front. His theory, of course, that low interest rates will lead to low inflation and vice versa, flies in the face of all accepted economic theory. On a more personal level, when you think of, well, surely he's still receiving expert advice, he must still know that he has to raise interest rates, that the Turkish economy is very vulnerable. Well, it's very unclear, because if you think about the mechanisms by which he would receive that sort of advice, that sort of input, they really aren't working. I mean, he's been known to lash out, even hit aides who bring him bad news. The bureaucracy, of course, has seen the well-publicized purges of hundreds of thousands of officials and bureaucrats who, supporting a family through a state job in Turkey, who would want to put all of that at risk by sort of raising their head above the parapet and delivering bad news to the president? So I think that there are very few mechanisms through which the sort of system can correct itself, and that's hugely worrying. So I think that's a pretty dire analytical look at what's happening on the Turkish side in terms of high-level decision making. On the U.S. side, of course, we have our own set of problems. What we've seen emerge, not just on Turkey, but clearly exhibited on the Turkish front, is basically a bipolar U.S. foreign policy, whereby the official interagency presents a certain policy, state and DoD. Usually it's more restrained, it's pretty level-headed. It would favor a gradual ramping up of pressure on Turkey. It would probably be primarily concerned, as Amanda alluded to with deterring Turkey from buying the Russian S-400 system, which to most U.S. policymakers is the more important strategic issue, even if Brunson and the other Americans detained pull at the heartstrings and are, of course, crucial issues in their own right. But then we've seen the president and the White House emerge as this sort of almost separate center of U.S. government policymaking. There's a lot of evidence of that on a number of fronts. I'd say on the Turkish front, first the fact that it was tweeted out, that was how the decision on the initial sanctions, the Magnitsky sanctions, was announced. Second, the follow-up being steel and aluminum tariffs, which is a Trump classic, a Trump special, I think demonstrates that this is driven by him. Recently, Ambassador Kilic, the Turkish ambassador, going straight to Bolton and sort of sidelining the State Department process that had begun is further evidence. And then Çavuşoğlu, the Turkish foreign minister's comments about, quote, confusion in the U.S. administration. I think he's probably, that's part public messaging, but it's also part him responding to these two streams of information that the Turks are receiving. So that's a problem. One of, Trump is primarily, I wouldn't say primarily, Trump is clearly concerned about the domestic side of the Brunson issue, which is deeply troubling, at least to me. That's visible in the way he talks about the issue and the way Vice President Pence talks about the issue. They constantly refer to Brunson's faith, the fact that he's a pastor, a Christian, a godly man, whereas I think most of us would agree that that's all fine, but that the U.S. government should be concerned with his well-being because he's a U.S. citizen, but they don't highlight that. That's a concern. The other thing is that Trump's actions, for example, tweeting the second, the aluminum and steel tariffs during Turkish Finance Minister al-Bayrak's press conference, they seem vindictive. It seems, as Amanda said, to be deeply, deeply personal at this point. And that's a problem because it plays on the worst instincts of both presidents, frankly. These big egos, they're fundamentally bullies, both of them, and they're now dug in and they see real political costs to backing down. But just because Trump seems so concerned with thumping his chest on this issue and has sort of backed Erdoğan into a corner doesn't mean that a harder approach, a stronger approach towards Turkey is necessarily wrong. I think that, as Amanda alluded to, this is the culmination of a long-term drift, and we shouldn't neglect Turkey's agency in this rupture. In time and again, Turkey has chosen to opt for confrontation with the United States and with the West more broadly rather than conciliation. Even the fact that we reached this point on the Brunson issue is down to Erdoğan's desire to negotiate on other fronts, particularly regarding the Halkbank sanctions, but other fronts, to use Brunson as leverage. And American officials warned the Turks clearly before Brunson's most recent hearings that there would be consequences if he wasn't released. They could have quietly released him and said the judicial process has run its course. They didn't do so, and by doing that, they ignored the U.S.'s clear ability to turn the sort of negotiated leverage entirely on the Turks. So 2 final points, and then I'll stop. Yes, certainly Erdogan's backed in a corner. Certainly he will now blame the Turkish economic crisis on the United States. The thing there is that he was going to blame the United States for the economic crisis anyway. In fact, he had been blaming the United States and the international community for years leading up to this point, and probably preparing the ground for exactly this time. And the second point is that he can still back down. Erdogan completely controls the Turkish media. He's just been reelected. Even in the local elections in Turkey next year, he can use this as a rallying cry and probably gain votes. He has every ability to back down. So it's really down to the sort of personal egos of these 2 presidents.
And Stephen, you're next.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Many thanks to Sonair for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share the forum with Amanda and Max. I see what you guys have done here. You've made the oldest go last, not necessarily the wisest, but the oldest go last. It's great to be back home at the Washington Institute. Little Stephen Cook fun fact, I did meet my wife at the Washington Institute, but at the old office, so this doesn't exactly feel the same to me, but it is really great. I see Rob Satloff in the back. Thank you very much, sir. I really appreciate it. But on to Turkey. My role here and what I'd like to do is to be purposely provocative. I agree with many of the things that Max and Amanda said, but I'd like to start with the bottom line of the U.S.-Turkey relationship. There are twin crises that are enveloping Turkey right now, the Lira crisis and the crisis in U.S.-Turkey relations. They are largely of Turkey's own making, and there's actually very little that the United States can do about it. The Turks, especially on the economy, have to be able to and willing to help themselves on the economy. President Trump's change in policy, which includes a dramatic increase in public pressure, is actually a welcome change in policy. I agree with Amanda and Max that the tweet of last Friday announcing aluminum and steel tariffs was perhaps gratuitous. Of course, it was entirely in keeping with the president's view of the world and his background as a negotiator in the rough and tumble world of New York real estate. And while I recognize that it, in fact, has given Erdogan even more material with which to blame the United States for Turkey's economic troubles, this is something, as Max just pointed out, Erdogan was doing already, that he has been doing at least since 2013 in the time of the Gezi Park protests, where he began railing about the interest rate lobby, about Ambassador Ricciardoni, about the CIA, about CNN, about Michael Rubin, about a variety of different people. So if there was no tweet from the president last Friday, you can be sure that even if no tweet but the same policy, President Erdogan, and even if there was no policy, the president of Turkey would be publicly blaming the United States for engaging in economic warfare, an economic coup, and imploring Turks to destroy their iPhones. Andrew Brunson is no doubt a flashpoint in the relationship, but the deterioration of U.S.-Turkey relations was already well underway. And this is where I disagree with something that Max said. I don't believe that this is about President Trump and President Erdogan. Yes, there are particular personality traits of both of them that make this a more difficult situation. But in fact, there have been changes underway for quite some time. That glue that held Turkey and the United States together over the Cold War no longer exists. The Cold War, I want to remind people, ended almost 30 years ago. It cannot be 1985 forever in this relationship. I think that rather than trying to save a relationship, we should recognize that there isn't a strategic relationship and figure out how to deal with a very important country on the face of it, but a country that is not as important to the United States as it once was. We need to develop alternatives, work with the Turks in places where we can, but oppose them in places where they very clearly have different interests and priorities than the United States. much of what we have thought about Turkey over the course of the last 10, 15 or more years about its strategic utility to the United States, about it being a model, as it being a force for peace in the region, are things that Westerners have imputed to Turkey. All of those projects that we thought that Turkey would be useful for, helping with soft landings in Central Asia after the end of the Cold War, helping to forge peace between Israelis and Palestinians, being a force for stability and security in the Middle East, being a model for Arab countries seeking to transition to more just and democratic societies. Turkey failed or was unable to or had no capacity to do any of those things. So we should stop talking about those things. We should stop talking about a strategic relationship for these important things that really doesn't exist. It is also hard to make the case that Turkey is an ally and a partner when you consider the long list of problems and issues that highlight the differences in priorities, interests, and goals. And let me just give you 9 or 10 of them. The Turks have opposed U.S. policy on Iran. They first negotiated a separate nuclear agreement with the help of the Brazilians. They opposed UN sanctions on Iran and then helped the Turks evade those sanctions. All in between all of that, they blew the cover on an Israeli intelligence operation gathering information on the Iran nuclear program. They have enabled extremists in Syria. They complicated the fight against the Islamic State in Syria and threatened U.S. forces in response. We called a working group to help them achieve their goals, in which they promised they would no longer threaten American forces in the region. They're, of course, buying the S-400, which is a potential threat to the F-35. The F-35, 100 of which the Turks hope to have in their arsenal. They have become a patron of Hamas and have stirred up trouble in Jerusalem. No matter what you think about President Trump's move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, stirring up trouble on the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, is the height of irresponsibility. They've established or are establishing a military presence in the Red Sea, which is unnerving our allies in Egypt and increasing tension between Egypt and Sudan and Egypt and Ethiopia, something that no one needs given the construction of the great Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. Turkey has been particularly aggressive in the Aegean since 2016. The Greek government, flat on its back from a terrible economic and financial crisis, has had to spend time and money defending its territory against unnecessarily provocative Turkish actions in the Red Sea. And then, of course, we have the arrest of Americans, not just Pastor Andrew Brunson, who happens to be a pastor, so I'm not quite sure why we should have a problem calling him that. Pastor Brunson, as well as anywhere between 15 to 20 Turkish Americans who are being held in Turkish jails. We don't know the exact number because, of course, the Turks have not permitted us consular access to all of these people. All of these people are being used as bargaining chips. I think Amnesty International used the term hostages in order to force the extradition of Fethullah Gülen or Mehmet Hakan Atilla to secure his release after being convicted in the largest sanctions-busting scheme in history. And, of course, there is the hounding of Americans in Turkey and abroad. Sitting just here is my good friend and colleague Henri Barkey, who has been pinned as being responsible in part for the failed coup d'etat, who can't go back to the land of his birth. I think that this is outrageous that Turkish courts and Turkish government and the Turkish press have gone after innocent American citizens. And then finally, an astounding 80% of Turks believe that the United States was complicit in the coup d'etat and is thus complicit with the economic coup d'etat. That is the direct result of a narrative that the Turkish government has emphasized over and over and over again, not just since the failed coup in July 2016, but for far longer, that the United States is out to undermine a NATO ally. Now, the Turks can answer each and every one of these criticisms. We work with the YPG. Fethullah Gülen was guilty. We have our own separate interests. All of those things are fine and valid. And if the Turks want to believe that the United States was involved in the coup, that's fine. If they make a good case that the YPG is part of the PKK, that is also valid. And it's also true. Of course, the Turks were ambivalent about the fight against the Islamic State. Their mirror image of these complaints are valid. They're issues that vex the Turkish government. They're issues that vex Turks more generally. But that doesn't mean that we have to accept all of their arguments. My point is that there really is no chance, at this moment at least, for getting back on the same page. There is no saving a strategic relationship when the strategic relationship was overrated to begin with. If you look at the record of the last 10 years, which I've just gone through, not as meticulously as I'd like, I don't have enough time, but you see that it's clear that we talk about Turkey as a strategic partner and a valuable ally and extremely, crucially, critically important, when it really hasn't been. It is important for the problems and headaches it has created for U.S. policymakers rather than for being a genuine partner of the United States. Thanks very much.
Right. I had promised you a panel with divergent views and room for debate. I think we have that. So before I open the floor for questions, I'd like to pick up my colleagues and thank you, Amanda, Max, and Stephen for excellent and insightful presentations, also for joining me today, of course. And so I think we should turn for a minute to Ankara and see how this looks from Ankara. Turkish President Erdoğan, of course, is one of the most consequential leaders of Turkish politics, and I would say of Europe and Middle East of the 21st century. He's won 13 nationwide ballots, always stacks odds in his favor. Won at least the first 10 of these after free and fair elections, these nationwide ballots. So thinking of Erdoğan's electoral political vision inside, and Turkey has nationwide local elections coming up next spring, but maybe even more long term. How would you look at how Erdoğan is handling the crisis? So I would argue that he's not really escalated. The sanctions that Turkey has slapped compare in size in terms of the damage they caused to U.S. sanctions, and maybe they're even smaller. And also Erdoğan has shied away from personally targeting President Trump. He's never said President Trump in his commentary. He often says they, or he does something the Turks love to do. He uses passive voice, where you don't have to talk about the pronoun. So he's avoiding putting his President Trump in his target. And he's also not de-escalated, of course. He's not taken steps to release Pastor Brunson, which would be sine qua non for de-escalation. So where do you think he's taking this from Ankara? Taking into account his electoral politics, his strategy, the state of the Turkish economy. If you could each say a few minutes, and this is also a chance for you to agree, disagree with each other. I'll have one more question after that, of course. Okay.
I am somewhat reluctant to put myself in the position of interpreting the psychology of Erdoğan in terms of how he is responding to this, but I agree with what you've said. I mean, so far I think we're at a point where things could be undone, and it is possible to step back from the brink. And I think, as others have said, it also has provided a convenient explanation in terms of rallying nationalist support to explain economic problems that were building otherwise. There's also questions of whether we've seen some of these releases this week of the Greeks, of Taner Kilic as a way of paving a path to move in that direction. So part of the question, I think, is going to be the amount of economic pain he believes he's able to withstand. There is a question about what Erdoğan ultimately wants out of this deal. I mean, to the extent that he is using Brunson as a tool for negotiations, what is the art of the deal? What is it that the United States needs to give to Erdoğan for him to feel that he has gotten enough, that he is able to move forward and get some sort of agreement? And then I think sort of the diplomatic niceties about how you sequence and unveil some of this is going to be easy enough to roll out. But I think the question is going to be whether you can find the sweet spot between appeasing Trump and getting Brunson home and achieving whatever it is that Erdoğan thinks he wants in a sufficiently near-term way before we end up with a massive economic rupture. One thought in response to some of Steve's intentionally provocative intervention is, I think there's counters that you certainly could provide to some of those. There's things that Turkey has been doing, for example, in Afghanistan, military contributions that it's made, significant contributions that it's made on the migration front. Which certainly remains one of Europe's main driving forces in having a good relationship with Turkey, given that Turkey is housing over 3.5 million refugees. And notwithstanding, again, some bartering there, you could argue it's actually a cynical process on both sides, with Europe trying to pay Turkey to keep the refugees there and Turkey trying to extract as high of a price as possible in order to not let the refugees continue to move on. I think the thing that I keep coming back to is, one, you've got about 50% of this country that does not support Erdoğan in the direction that he's trying to move the country. And so I think it is important, notwithstanding a challenging government in Turkey and, frankly, a challenging government here in the United States, to remember that countries are ultimately bigger than their leaders. And so how you can preserve some sort of relationship between these countries, even during periods of difficult political leadership. The other question is what the alternative is. As difficult as it is to deal with Turkey inside NATO right now, and frankly, we don't even have a mechanism to expel countries from NATO, it's going to be that much more difficult to deal with a Turkey that is outside NATO, especially a Turkey that feels forced to pivot to closer relationships with Turkey and Iran if it is diplomatically distanced from the West.
Max, Stephen? Yeah.
Sure.
Max, go ahead.
I think in terms of how Erdoğan is handling the crisis and what his game is here, I do think that there was a miscalculation, that he was still in the mindset of he was dealing with Obama, which was going to be a rational, deliberate, restrained policy, but he's not. And he got, I think, perhaps a stronger response from Trump than he was bargaining for. But I think what they want is a reduction or perhaps an elimination of the Halkbank fine, because I think that is, an arrow, a dagger at the Turkish banking sector at a time when it is extraordinarily vulnerable. And a Halkbank fine of any size, and if it were in line with past fines, it could be $10 billion, would be just devastating to Turkish banking sector, which would then have to shift the debts onto the public fisc and would, devastate Turkish reserves, but would also completely destroy what little market confidence there is in the Turkish economy. So I think that's Erdogan's primary goal, is to, bargain Brunson for a reduction in the Halkbank fine. I think that's still a miscalculation, though, because it seems, and sorry, to finish that thought, the U.S., I think the State Department would likely recommend to the president that he wait, that he's made his point. The Turkish economy is really hurting. And on October 12th at Brunson's next hearing, it's likely he'll be released. But you need to give Erdogan this face-saving way out. But I don't think Trump will respond to that argument, as we've seen. I think that the next shoe will probably drop well before October 12th. I hope I'm wrong, because I think the best thing would be for this to sort of settle down for a bit. But that's what I fear. Responding also to something Stephen said, that was a very good and provocative laying out of how the interests diverge. I would just like to talk a bit about why that might be, and there are two primary reasons. As I said, the sort of traditional restraints on Erdogan are gone in the military and the foreign ministry, and so he's able to act on his personal views. And what are his personal views? I think he's said most of them publicly. He's on the record. He believes the world is bigger than five, as he repeats again and again. So he thinks the world is fundamentally multipolar. He thinks the U.S. is in decline relative to other powers. And he also thinks that the West writ large, particularly the U.S., is somewhat hypocritical in its espousal of democracy and human rights. He's got a bit of a point on all of these fronts. But what that's led him to do is say, right, Turkey should be a power. This is a multipolar world. We should be a power in our own right, which means we should cultivate more independent, closer relations with the likes of Russia and China and Iran and these other powers, and with less deference to our traditional security ties to the West. And the United States' response to that has been, well, no, you have to choose, particularly on the Russia front, because NATO was built to defend against the Russians. You can't have that cozy relationship. And the Turks are chafing against that, that forced binary choice. The other side is domestic. And then I'll stop, Stephen. I know you're chomping at the bit. The other side is domestic. Erdogan's Erdogan's, he's really built this sort of new nationalism in Turkey. He started with devout working class Turks, the traditional AKP constituency. He won over a lot of business-minded conservatives and in the early days some liberals with his outreach to Kurds and some of his loosening of old, Kemalist secular restrictions. He lost the Kurds, of course, finally and spectacularly in 2014, 2015, and he lost liberals before that. So he pivoted to the hard nationalist right. And he's actually holding together a quite diverse constituency, because there are a lot of things that those nationalist Turks and the more devout working class AKP, hardcore supporters don't agree on, from education to all sorts of social issues. But one of the things they do agree on is a strong state that stands up to the West. And so Erdogan has really played on the things that strengthen the glue that holds his constituency together. So both for his personal worldview, his instincts, and also his domestic political imperatives and incentives, both of those things push him to confrontation rather than conciliation.
Very quickly, how has Erdogan handled the crisis? I think absolutely beautifully. He is just an extraordinary politician. The book that Sonair did not mention, I have a passage in which I talk about Erdogan being the best politician this side of Bill Clinton. And he really understands how to speak to the Turks. And during this crisis, he has done precisely that. He has hammered away at a narrative that is politically profitable for him, as well as other politicians in Turkey. But there's the way in which Erdogan does it that is particularly effective. But as Sonair has said, while doing that, by encouraging people to destroy their iPhones, while railing about an economic coup, he hasn't actually escalated. He hasn't actually taken on Donald Trump directly, which is very smart, because it provides him an opportunity to do precisely the kinds of things that Amanda is suggesting be done. That we come to some sort of agreement and we reduce the pressure and we have some sort of agreement. What worries in all things being equal, if we were in a different world, I would be 100% supportive of that, but for the record, in which we get together with the Turks, we work it out, and then they don't keep up their end of the bargain. And American goodwill is taken for granted. Just a number of responses to two things that you guys had said. Certainly, Amanda, the Turks deserve a lot of credit for Afghanistan. They were there from the beginning. They were among the first countries to deploy, if not the first country to deploy after Operation Enduring Freedom began. They deserve all the credit in the world for the treatment of refugees in their country. It is totally different from the way in which it used to be, and they absolutely deserve credit. Of course, they have used the presence of those refugees to actually threaten Europe. And threaten to destabilize Europe, knowing what's happening with the populist right in Europe. A couple other points. I mentioned that 50% of the country don't support Erdogan. I don't think we should make the analytic leap that because 50% of the country don't support Erdogan, that they support the United States or that they support a strong U.S.-Turkey relationship. Once again, our approval ratings in Turkey are hovering in the high single digits and low double digits. 80%, a stupefying number, believe that the United States was complicit in the coup. I'm not convinced that Turkish leaders or a large number of Turks themselves are committed to the Atlantic Alliance in the same way that we think that they should be committed to the Atlantic Alliance. Now, I have heard Amanda's point, well, wouldn't the sky fall if Turkey were outside of NATO? First of all, there is no mechanism to throw Turkey out of NATO. I have no idea what Bernard-Henri Levy was talking about in the Wall Street Journal. I read the piece twice. People keep saying this. I have no idea what it means to throw Turkey out of NATO. The only way Turkey gets out of NATO is Turkey says, I'm leaving. The Turks say that they're leaving NATO. But if you take a look at the long list of things that the Turks have done, we're talking about margins of more things that they can do to make our lives as difficult as possible if they were outside of NATO. Last couple points. Max, you really made my point at the end there. Better, I think, than I did. So congratulations. The world is bigger than five. The West is hypocritical, and the United States. On the last point, though, the West is forcing the Turks to choose. I think we should be okay if the Turks believe that their interests are better served by developing closer relations with alternative countries. I don't think it'll come. It will end well for them. But I think structural changes in international politics are leading us to this point. We have different priorities and interests. The United States has changed politically. Turkey has changed politically. They have different priorities and interests. I think that we should acknowledge that, recognize it, and rather than talking about saving a relationship, use those ideas to think more productively about what a future relationship might look like. I'm not certainly calling for a breach in the relationship. Turkey's too important a country, but I do think that when you outline the long list of things that the Turks have done to try to undermine American foreign policy, it's very, very hard to talk about a country that way as an ally.
Can I just make one comment on opinion polls, which I think if you look at opinion polls in the U.S., there was one recently showing a staggeringly high percentage of Americans now believe that we shouldn't come to the defense of countries who aren't paying their military dues.
Well, look,
so I think there is something
we can engage in this
about
kind of whataboutism all day long. We know over a long period of time there's a vast reservoir of anti-Americanism in Turkey.
No, my point was just simply that certainly political rhetoric and media have a way of shaping public perceptions. We've seen the same in the U.S. We've seen the same in Turkey. So my only question would be if you had, in the future, some sort of different leadership with different political rhetoric, whether there would be a shift in the public or whether that is, in fact, a deeply held perspective.
I would agree. I think opinions definitely change, which is taking me to my next question. Something that puzzles me as an historian, how countries' geographic political identities are not immutable. We think they are, but they change. Finland was considered East European until the interwar period. It became Nordic magically. Greece and Turkey were considered Western Europe in the Cold War. Greece became Southern Europe. Turkey became Middle East. So with that in mind, Turkey's kind of let's say, disappearing European Union vocation, which we're not going to discuss. The question I want to take you to is Erdoğan's desire for a reset with Europe that came up in a couple of presentations. How does, with this new Turkey in mind, that has pivoted itself largely to the Middle East, the reset is a little bit shocking, maybe refreshing, that Turkey is once again embracing its European partners. So I want to ask you how you think reset works and if it works. Maybe we'll take the opposite order this time. So you want to go first? Yeah.
That would not be the opposite.
That would not be the opposite.
All right, good. You want to go first?
Sure, I can.
Opposite would be me.
Now you've confused us so now.
I'm happy to go first, as long as we're clear that it's not opposite.
Let Amanda go first.
I meant the opposite of volunteers. Yeah. Go ahead.
Very confused. To me, the reset with Europe is not entirely shocking. If you look at what's happening to Turkey economically, it needs to have friends that it continue to trade with. It certainly has a much bigger economic relationship with Europe than it does with the United States. So from the perspective of economics, from the perspective of investment, especially if you look at countries like Germany and the Netherlands that have a high degree of investment in Turkey, it makes sense to repair those relationships. And I even think diplomatically it does. It's not in Turkey's advantage to be diplomatically isolated from all of its neighbors. So to me, it's not entirely surprising that at the same time that you have a deepening crisis with the U.S., you would have Turkey trying to mend some of its relationships with Europe. The other thing I found somewhat interesting is looking at some of the messaging that's been coming out of Europe, where you've had various ministers, I think the German economic minister earlier this week, being critical of the United States for having imposed sanctions. And so you can almost see Erdoğan somewhat cleverly shifting the narrative away from Turkey is bad because it has political prisoners to the United States is bad because it is unfairly imposing economic sanctions on Europe and on Turkey in the name of national security grounds. In terms of how this works, I personally think that it is good that the EU has not formally curtailed the accession process with Turkey. I completely accept that accession is not going to happen for the foreseeable future, not least because of the rule of law situation in Turkey, but I think maintaining it as a framework is useful. Secondly, I've long been an advocate of the European Union looking at upgrading the customs union with Turkey. This is something that would have economic advantages to Turkey, but more importantly is it would bind Turkey into a rules-based framework, and it would actually call Erdoğan's bluff in terms of whether or not he was prepared to make some of the necessary reforms as a way of getting some of these economic benefits from Europe.
May I?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Just to your quick point, Soner, about countries changing and not immutable. Yes, they change. Turkey was once an ally and no longer. And opinion and views of that alliance change over time. Maybe it'll change back, but at the moment it's quite hostile to it. Anyway, I think the thing about the EU charm offensive for me that is the level and height of cynicism is just impressive, absolutely impressive. The Turks got in trouble with the United States, and the Amnesty International, the head of the Amnesty International office in Turkey is released. The 2 Greek soldiers are suddenly released. I do understand, however, the Europeans' willingness to countenance this kind of cynicism for a number of reasons. First, after President Trump's performance at the NATO meeting, in which he basically disabused anybody of at least his commitment to Europe, I think that there's very little. And I think this is perhaps the first example of it. Very little reason to believe that the Europeans are going to stick with us in certain types of conflicts. And I think that secondly, and most importantly, the stakes are higher for Europe than they are for the United States. Turkey is integrated with Europe economically in ways that it's not. European banks are exposed to this lira crisis in Turkey. There is still the specter of refugees coming into Europe, and so the Europeans have every reason to seek some sort of accommodation with Erdoğan, even if they don't like him, and if they understand that he is doing this for cynical reasons.
I'm highly skeptical of the charm offensive. I think, for the reasons I outlined earlier, in Turkey, the structural political incentives drive Erdoğan to confrontation with the West writ large. That will include Europe again at some point, I strongly suspect. At some point, the Europeans, for their own domestic reasons and for the values that they espouse, will criticize events in Turkey, and the Turkish response will be, strong and personal, and will be back, in a tit-for-tat war of words, I suspect. The fundamental choice that is maybe not as far out as we all would hope for both Europe and the United States is Turkey has largely put itself in this economic bind. It has been the unfortunate on the Syrian front in the huge stress that nearly 4 million refugees bring and have placed on Turkey. That is not Turkey's fault, and they have acquitted themselves admirably on that front. But both of those problems are likely to come to a head in the next 2 years, and the choice facing the U.S. and more immediately Europe will be: do we intervene forcefully to try and stabilize Turkey, knowing that will prop up Erdoğan's autocratic regime, knowing that will bail out Erdoğan on the economic front for many of his own mistakes, for his own profligacy and his own refusal to make reforms that were necessary because he wanted to continue this sort of credit-fueled growth spurt and continue to reap those benefits without paying the cost. Weighing that sort of real moral dilemma against the prospect of Turkey becoming truly destabilized, because Amanda alluded to Idlib in her opening remarks. It's a crucial issue that's been largely lost in the economic tumult. There are 3.5 million Syrians in Idlib. The regime, with the backing of the Russians and the Iranians, are likely to go in the near term, pushing God knows how many Syrians to the Turkish border. On top of the nearly 4 million Syrians in Turkey, that could be a hugely destabilizing event. At the same time as we're likely to see this default loop begin in the Turkish economy, whereby we're in a pause in the depreciation of the lira, where stabilizing between 5.5 and 6 to the dollar, but the real economy hasn't yet adjusted to the lira at 6 to the dollar, and there are still a handful of big Turkish companies that employ, conglomerates that employ tens of thousands of people, who will not be able to roll over debts indefinitely at 6 lira to the dollar. And so coming down the pike at U.S. and Europe is the question of an IMF package of some kind to bail out Turkey. That's going to be a tough sell in Washington, because Washington will say, now hang on, we warned them about this for years. We're in this deep political crisis. Why would we do this? On the European front, For those reasons, alongside the fact that Şebnem Kalemli-Özcan, a great economist you should all read, was talking with her this morning. She pointed out, the Europeans still have Italy out there. They have a large ticking time bomb. They might need their credit, their reserves for Italy. They still have Greece, of course. They could have big Spanish defaults, as Steve alluded to. Spanish banks are hugely exposed to Turkey. So, the Europeans are going to be in a difficult bind there also. So there's going to be this question of moral hazard. Do we bail out the strong man against the desire to prevent Turkey from becoming a completely sort of destabilized economic basket case right on the European border?
Just quickly on that, I think Turkey's economy is so integrated into the global economic system that Ankara has realized it can't afford to have bad ties with both Europe and the United States. So, when ties with Europe or U.S. were okay, it could afford to have crises with Europe, but now it's flipped. So you have a crisis with the United States, and which is why I think the reset is, although it may not go as far as people think it would, I think it's driven by real ambition and real desire in Ankara. And of course, Europe doesn't want to see Turkey's economy collapse because it borders Turkey. It doesn't have the luxury of being an ocean apart. And, exposure of Spanish banks, definitely Achilles heel. And last but not least, I think Turkey and Europe also share certain similar positions vis-a-vis the U.S., Iran sanctions, Iranian oil purchases, which will probably bind Turkey and Europe in many areas. Finally, on the U.S. side, I also think, and my colleagues can continue to agree and disagree with me as well, with each other on this during the Q&A. Perhaps, we are at a point where we can come down the ladder. I think Erdoğan's not escalating the crisis to the point of targeting President Trump is an escape pod in that regard. And I think that there are, even the Brunson issue is resolved, of course, there are very valid concerns on both sides why the relationship might face future crises. And Stephen went through the list, and I just want to add one more on the Turkish side. I think U.S. policy of working with the YPG, that's an offshoot of the PKK's, completely unacceptable, will not change. So, if you can't fudge that through, it's going to be difficult to find a solution to that, and that could be the source of future crisis. But Manbij is a good deal, which is why I think both sides have made an effort to compartmentalize military ties from the current political crisis. And that's why I think there's also faith on both sides that they believe that when the time comes to restore the relationship, it can be restored on basis of military ties, which are kept in an airtight compartment from the crisis that is unfolding right now. So that's probably a good sign. On that, if my colleagues have anything to add, comment?
I was just going to agree with Max's economic analysis. I mean, for me, the one question is whether or not Erdoğan would actually agree to IMF intervention, because the IMF would force them to adopt economic reform policies, including austerity, and that would lead to unemployment and also real pain for Turkish citizens, which would then undermine a certain amount of the support that Erdoğan has gained for providing people with an economically beneficial way of life.
Let me just point out one other thing. The IMF may be more difficult in sooner rather than later for the Turks. If the issue of Andrew Brunson and the other Americans being held, as well as the Foreign Service nationals who are in jail or under house arrest, are not resolved, there is legislation that recently passed out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee unanimously. Let me repeat that, unanimously. Democrats and Republicans in Washington agreeing on something, and that something is to prohibit the United States from supporting any economic assistance from the IMF or the World Bank to Turkey, so long as those Americans are held and those Foreign Service nationals are being detained. It seems that the Congress cannot agree on anything other than punishing. The one thing they can agree on is punishing the Turks. So there is a certain exigency. We shouldn't talk about the IMF as if it's going to be so automatic. The United States is not necessarily going to support that.
Open to close to questions now. Mike's coming around. I've seen Aaron first, so we'll start with you. Please identify yourselves. We have cameras and reporters in the room, and tell us who you are and which institution you represent.
Aaron Stein, the Atlantic Council. I have a question for Stephen and for everybody. The crises that you lay out, and I would add to them about bombing Iraq on 3 different occasions during the 1990s from Turkish air bases, are all out of area. And so is your prescription about the alliance more about the Middle East than it is about NATO? That's one. And two, for maybe the panel writ large, about Europe. I believe Turkey views the United States as a destabilizing power because of its policies in the Middle East since 1991. I believe Europe shares that affinity since Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. But what I do not see as synergies beyond that in this balancing effort by Erdoğan is synergies between Europe and Turkey on Russia. So is that possibility, particularly over the S-400 purchase, it's not just Americans and Turks who will operate F-35. How would you recommend on the bilateral level, given everything that's going on, that you try and up pressure and win cooperation from Turkey on its entente, let's be polite, with Moscow?
Let me start very quickly. Not all of these crises are out of area. Of course, my whole thing in life is the Middle East, so that's where But of course, if American officials have voiced concern about Turkish policy in the Balkans, and you just pointed out yourself, the entente with the Russians is obviously a huge problem and very much within area. The Middle East, look. Erdoğan and the Justice and Development Party see Turkey as a great Muslim power, as a natural leader of the Muslim world, and it has been quite active in that area. And the United States has been the predominant power in the region for the better part of the last 3 decades. Once again, I will go back to the two countries do not share interests, goals, or priorities. In a place where the U.S. foreign policy has been most active and where Turkey seeks to be a leader. Turkey is not Iran, of course, but it could be grouped within those countries that want to see the rules of the road as they've been established by the United States and its allies in the region changed, because those rules of the road do not allow Turkey to fully realize what it believes to be its proper role in the Middle East.
Do you guys want to comment, or?
I don't know if I entirely understood the second part of your question on the Russia piece. I mean, it seems to me that you've got broader concern within this European F-35 consortium shared with the United States about the potential incompatibility of the Russian S-400s and the F-35s. But what seems to be a problem is you've got increasing divergence within Europe in terms of attitudes toward Russia, especially as you have some of these more populist parties coming to power. You've got countries with greater sympathy there. You've got countries like Greece that are trying to balance their relationships as well with maintaining ties with Moscow. And you also have an American president who is quite keen to try and improve relations there. So it seems that you really have a split on both sides of the Atlantic and also within Europe in terms of some of these perspectives on Russia.
Max?
I think on how you would increase pressure, in a perfect world where you could control the U.S. president, I think my approach would be to say, Mr. President, you've made your point, and what you've done is build up credibility for our future threats of consequences if you move forward with the S-400 purchase. For now, let's lie low on the Brunson issue. They're likely to release him on October 12th. And the State Department will continue to message very clearly to Turkey that the S-400 purchase is unacceptable and would have very serious consequences on the F-35 program and other fronts, intelligence sharing among them. And then I think, would have the Defense Department sort of playing the good cop here, and General Mattis or Secretary Mattis, messaging clearly to the Turks, we value your input. We want to keep you in all of these programs, but you really cannot deploy the S-400. You cannot buy this system. That's our threshold. And you hope the message gets through, but you have to hedge that it will not, or that Turkey just sees its interests as bifurcated here, that it wants to itself hedge with the Russians through the S-400 purchase and other aspects of their relationship, energy and the nuclear power plant among them. And that hedge would be, beginning preparations for a worst case scenario in terms of relations with Turkey, whereby this nationalist trend continues. There's no reason there's no sign it's not going to continue. So hedge for that eventuality, begin to take steps to prepare for the eventual, potential loss of access to Turkish installations, Incirlik, Malatya, Konya, begin a planning process to adapt the Western security architecture for, if not a formal break with Turkey, the sort of de facto situation wherein you can't trust the Turks vis-a-vis Russia, because I don't think that's the most likely outcome, but it would be irresponsible not to plan for the potentiality.
I have Henri Barkey next, here in the front. Come to you.
Thank you. Henri Barkey from Lehigh University and Council on Foreign Relations. I have a question for all of you, but Max, something you said kind of made me think. They wanted to avoid a fine of, let's say, $10 billion on Halkbank. This little crisis costs them more than $10 billion, that's for sure. I mean, it's kind of a little bit foolish. To me, what's interesting in all of this, and I would like to flip the issue a little bit, of all the problems that Turkey and the United States have, some of them are real. The YPG, S-400s. Brunson, and we shouldn't only talk about Brunson because there are the Free Foreign Service nationals as well, is the least important in the sense that it should not have been allowed to reach this level, that the United States should have tried and to get him released much earlier, as well as the Foreign Service nationals. Why didn't the United States do that? And what does it say about U.S. thinking, at least under the Trump administration, about Turkey? Because presumably, especially when you look at the indictments and the accusations against those people, it's completely conspiratorial. It's really wacko. So the United States should have taken a much more active role to get them released, and we would not be here in this situation. Why didn't they do it?
I mean, I'm happy to take a stab at that. I mean, it goes back to what I started with in my opening comments. I mean, I think this is something that the U.S. has been working on for the last year, and I think the U.S. tried to solve this through diplomatic outreach. You can offer the criticism or the feedback that was not the right approach and it was not the successful approach, but I think that was something that was actively worked. On the question of the Foreign Service nationals, I mean, you remember at the end of last year that the U.S. Embassy in Ankara stopped issuing visas for a period of time until they got security guarantees from the Turks. So it's not that the U.S. has not done anything or has not tried to engage on this issue at all. And I think the approach of the administration really has been to try and work through these diplomatic working groups. I mean, the one that was set up on defense issues was at least successful in coming up with this Manbij roadmap. There was another one set up to deal with judicial issues that seems to have led to some progress with the FBI saying that it would do more on Gulen. And the prisoner issues being worked as part of this. So I don't know all of the inside details of what was being worked, but certainly there's been enough that has come out in the press that suggests that there was some deal that was being worked and they were close to reaching some sort of agreement on that. What seems to have happened, and this is some of what Max was alluding to, was that Trump got very personally involved in this and I think was somewhat impatient for some sort of agreement to be reached. And that seems to have escalated some of what was happening. So, you can certainly accept the criticisms that what was tried have not worked, but I would reject the idea that efforts have not been made by the U.S. administration to try and resolve some of these things.
Do you have a question for me? Yeah, you could just tell me later. But I just want to respond to something that Amanda said. It strikes me, maybe it's me, but it strikes me as odd when you go through all of these kind of bureaucratic things that the United States has to do to deal on kind of issues that are Turkey's making, that we have to go to these kind of Herculean bureaucratic diplomatic efforts to resolve things, yet we continue to refer to this country as a strategic ally of the United States, about them holding American citizens, about getting the FBI involved in this, conspiracy about the Gulen. And maybe the Gulenists were involved in it, but if the Turks would provide compelling evidence of his guilt, I think he would be extradited. But we have constantly these working groups, and the working groups about them not shooting at American soldiers. This, to me, is really kind of strange.
Although it's not entirely different from what
do
Germany.
that with Britain?
I mean, Germany
Canada?
Germany
Well,
has
maybe
done
soon with Canada.
Germany's done the same thing with Turkey. I mean, Germany also had political prisoners. I think Germany tried to do a lot of diplomatic outreach. Finally, worked a deal to get Denise worked out. So some of this is not unique to the way the U.S. government is responding.
No. I'm not criticizing the U.S. government. What I'm saying is it's odd to think that we have to go through all of this in our dealings with a strategic ally. So maybe it's not a strategic ally. This just doesn't seem normal. Do we do this with our other strategic partners? Do we have these kinds of range of problems that require this kind of diplomatic and bureaucratic maneuvering to move things incrementally in a direction where where we believe and hope the Turks aren't going to do things that undermine American policy or target American citizens? It just we don't do that with our other allies and partners in this way.
We're waiting for more questions. I like that the questions are brief and the answers are snappy, and we're having conversation. So I'm trying to move from left to right. And I have Begum next, and then you, sir. Mike here in the front.
Recently joined the VOA Turkish service team here. So my question would be maybe for all of the panelists. Soner has touched upon this a little bit. Max has already touched upon this a little bit. But Pentagon seems to be playing the good cop here on the deepening crisis, and we've seen that the statements coming from the Defense Department are a little bit restrained. But U.S. officials are already warning that if the crisis prolongs, there could be some problems, in the intelligence sharing, as well as the fight against ISIS. So, do you see that happening in the future? Like Amanda has already mentioned the Manbij roadmap. So, if the crisis prolongs, could the Manbij roadmap also fall apart because it will be very difficult for the people working at the Defense Department to defend Turkey when there is no solution to the crisis in the near future? Thank you.
I mean, I think there's lots of ways that this could escalate and things could go wrong. I mean, you can imagine a host of things on both sides that could be done in retaliatory measures as this escalates. I mean, as somebody, I don't know if it was Soner or Stephen said, I mean, I think military things have been kept somewhat in a separate channel. And Manbij has the potential to go wrong for all sorts of reasons completely unrelated to this spat. I mean, the U.S. and Turkey have very different definitions of who should be in the Manbij Governing Council. There's still the question of whether or not the U.S. keeps troops in Syria as Trump wants to pull them out. There have been a lot of press reports of YPG SDF officers in Damascus meeting with the regime and potentially working out some sort of deal. And then there's everything that happens in Idlib. So I think for right now, some of the military channels are somewhat separated from some of these larger disputes, although certainly everything with the S-400s and F-35s comes into play there. But I worry about things going wrong in Manbij for completely unrelated reasons.
You guys want to add anything? Or good. All right. Question here in the front again. Can we get the mic?
I'm an intelligence analyst, a Mideast broadcaster, and a former diplomat. I can think of fewer things more delightful than Russia selling its top-of-the-line equipment to a NATO ally. And I can only hope that the U.S. objections are pro forma and that Russia sells more top-of-the-line equipment to NATO allies. That would be delightful as an intel guy. I also note that intelligence sharing has already taken a hit. We didn't want intel used against our allies in Afrin. The big puzzle to me is how a fundamental pastor is being linked to Islamist Gulenists. And I'm wondering if we have demarched MIT to tell us what they've got. Have we demanded some evidence for these accusations to just shed a little light on what the heck these guys are thinking? Have any of you heard what the specifics of the charges are?
Yeah, I mean, the stated charges are support for terrorist organization, and the listed terrorist organizations are both FETÖ, the Gulenists, terror organization as the Turkish government refers to them, and the PKK. Now that sort of on its face is pretty absurd, knowing, of course, that the Gulenists and the PKK didn't really agree on anything ever. Also, some of the evidence being presented is absurd on its face. For example, Brunson's possession of a recipe for an Arab dish favored by Gülenists, supposedly. The U.S. government, has been unequivocal about Brunson's innocence, so they clearly feel that they're on solid ground. They're allowing the president, the vice president, and senior officials to consistently refer to him as innocent. So, they still have credibility, whereas the Turkish government's definition of guilt and definition of support for a terrorist organization has been shown over the last, I'll say 5 years. That's generous, though, to be completely outrageous. There's this definition of collective guilt being applied in Turkey, in modern Turkey, that's outrageous. A subscription to Zaman newspaper, or writing for Zaman newspaper, or dollar bills, having a bank account at Bank Asya, which was one of the Gülenist banks, all are sufficient to to get you thrown in jail, or at least detained, or at least lose your state job. So on the Turkish side, there's no credibility, and referring to the need for the judicial process to run its course, well, I think we've seen again and again and again that there is no judicial process if Erdoğan wants it to go one way or the other. So I would certainly point to those things. It's occurred to a lot of us. Well, if they buy the S-400, surely the U.S. can just get some engineers in there and reverse engineer it, and learn everything they can about it. But that's if you trust, that it's more the political message it would send. Buying this system, the likely need for Russian technicians to accompany it, the information and the cyber implants that would likely be placed in this system that the Russians could exploit. Aaron's sitting right here in the front row. He knows more about the technical aspects than I do, certainly. But it's the political message, and it would, exploiting it in that way would require a relationship built on trust, which doesn't currently exist, clearly.
You guys want to add anything?
Max,
I just wanted to quickly add also, although I'm the moderator, I think that Brunson's charges are not just that he is Gülenist, but primarily that he worked with the PKK. So I think the Gülenist party is really, I would say, overzealous of Turkish prosecutors, perhaps. But what I wanted to also weigh in before I come to you, sir, over there for question is the issue of military ties keeps coming up, whether they're in good shape or not. It's my impression that intelligence, military security cooperation remains strong. And that's why I think it's a good sign, because it suggests that leaderships in both capitals are trying to maintain at least one robust leg of the relationship for a future reset.
Are we entirely sure? My view has been, and where I sit and what I work on, is that there are differences within the Pentagon over Turkey.
Yeah.
Certainly CENTCOM, where it's most active, has not only the legacy of 2003, but a variety of other issues has made for a very difficult relationship. Whereas EUCOM, where Turkey actually falls, there are better relations. But my understanding is there is bureaucratic friction within the Pentagon over how best to approach Turkey.
That's true, but I think Secretary Mattis is a big fan of the relationship, and he's the one who's, I think, doing a lot to keep it together for good reasons. Yes, please.
Greg Rose, formerly at the Defense Department. On the NATO issue, obviously, as already been alluded to, there are many ways to sort of downgrade a member state's participation in the NATO alliance. And I think intelligence cooperation is an example. I'm not advocating for it. And like you said, I think all agree it's probably, I guess, Steve, you don't agree, it's probably best that we don't at this point cut off the military ties. And the Pentagon is inevitably thinking about what happens if Turkey cuts off the base, shuts down the NATO base. The mechanisms include the fact that when Turkey, for example, denies access by political leadership of NATO countries to their troops at places like the base in Turkey, that there are issues that can cause suspensions of certain participations in the alliance. When you look at what happened with Greece when the dictatorship happened, there have been instances in the past when, because of political changes in NATO alliance countries, we've mitigated or suspended participation in a lot of things. But my question is not about Europe. It's about Egypt, the Gulf states, that are... Erdoğan clearly has had a policy of brinkmanship and problematic behavior that has caused many other countries outside of Europe and the United States to have problems with him. I'm wondering how much that plays into this issue about U.S.-Turkey relations. And the other part of that question is, frankly, Russia. clearly Russia and Turkey are not strategically logical allies. They have many, many contradictory strategic interests, whether it's in Syria, whether it's the Black Sea, whether it's Russia's policy towards Turkic populations in its southern areas and south of its borders. So I guess my question is about Egypt, about the Gulf states, and about this issue about, is Russia really an ally of Turkey, or could it even be considered one?
I guess that's for me. Thanks for the questions, good ones. I know your question wasn't about Incirlik, but I think that in thinking about it, I think we want to avoid coming to a situation where that might happen, and that is a plausible scenario, given everything that has happened. I think we've agreed that there isn't perhaps an opportunity for de-escalation here, but there's always the opportunity that something's going to come along. And I think that that's important, and this is hitting on something that Max had said before, which is that we need to prepare for some options for ourselves. That I don't think anybody advocates closing Incirlik and abandoning Incirlik, but thinking about how we can redistribute some of the things that we knew out of Incirlik to other places in the region that will serve us, if not as well, but will be stopgaps for us should we no longer be able to use Incirlik in the way that we have in the past. And of course, the use of Incirlik in the way in which we've been using it against the Islamic State was the subject of a year-long negotiation. So it's not like we just kind of waltz in there and they say, okay, whatever it is that you want to do. But your question is about Turkey and the Middle East and President Erdoğan. If you go around the Middle East and you look at different capitals, Turkey has difficult relations with all of the major capitals. And I think it's and much of it is linked. In Egypt, of course, Erdoğan welcomed the Muslim Brotherhood after the coup d'etat. And has allowed them to use Turkey as a base for which to delegitimize the government of Abdel Fattah Sisi. This not only upsets the Egyptians for obvious reasons, but because the Gulf states, the two major ones, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have basically refloated the Egyptian economy and have been the patrons of Abdel Fattah Sisi and don't want to and regard Erdogan's allies in the delegitimization of Sisi as terrorists themselves. This has also created very, very difficult relations between those countries and Turkey. And of course, there's Turkey's bid to lead the Muslim world. I think if you ask Egyptians and Saudis, they are the leaders of the Muslim world, not just the Middle East. And then, of course, there's the issue, the ongoing issues with Israel. So if you think about the most important capitals in the Middle East, you have Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Cairo, Jerusalem. Those are very, very difficult relations that the Turks have. Does that play into? Does the U.S.-Turkey relationship play into that? I think that, as my presentation would suggest, a lot of the friction is over the Middle East. But if your question is how is Trump's relationship, this administration's relationship with those countries, figuring into the conflict, I think it strikes me that these four countries that I've been talking about have been somewhat quiet about this. I think that there's probably a level of satisfaction within the Egyptian Ministry of Defense.
In Arabic, it's called Schadenfreude.
Right, exactly. In Arabic, it's called El Schadenfreude. So no one is terribly unhappy about the situation that Erdogan finds himself in. And then making it worse was Abir Tamim of Qatar showed up in Turkey and offered $15 billion for the Turks, which is minuscule in comparison to what the Turks actually need, but it adds to this kind of friction within the region.
Just on Russia, I agree with your analysis. I've been a little bit skeptical about whether or not what Turkey is doing is a full-on strategic pivot to Russia for exactly the reasons that you've laid out. There's a certain economic dependence, there's a large energy dependence, there's a need by Turkey to have at least acquiescence from Russia for it to be able to do some of the military operations it's wanted to do against the Kurds in Syria. So I think it's a relationship born out of a certain amount of political and economic necessity. But as you said, there's a lot of differences between them. Russia has seen it as the capacity to turn off the taps and impose real economic pain on Turkey. And I think if we end up seeing this conflict play out in Idlib, it has the potential to spike relations because we're going to have Turkey and Russia again on opposite sides of the endgame in Syria.
Max?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is what confuses me is, Erdogan has almost absolute control, 90% of the Turkish media. And yet, the front pages of the Turkish media, or the government-controlled media, are dominated by the negative aspects of the U.S.-Turkish relationship. Everything the U.S. is doing, supporting the PKK, harboring Gulen, all of these things which, fine, even if you accept them as legitimate Turkish grievances, there are comparable Russian actions. You know, Russia has also supported the Afrin branch of the YPG. Russia, of course, propped up Assad. Erdogan's public enemy number one for years. They've helped push millions of Syrian refugees into Turkey. They've bombed schools and hospitals. They've taken all sorts of actions that are very detrimental to Turkish interests, and yet you don't see any of that on the front pages of Turkish newspapers. And I always wonder why. And that's where, because I share your analysis. Why is Turkey sort of playing footsie or more than footsie, whatever it is exactly that they're doing with Russia? What is the end? What is the goal? What do they get out of this? Certainly, acquiescence in Syria for these operations against the YPG is a big one. But it doesn't make sense, and that's, I think, where a lot of the sort of longer-term suspicion on the U.S. side comes from, is because these seem to be choices again and again and again to highlight the differences with the U.S. and cover up or downplay the differences with Russia, and you just have to wonder why.
Well, I think it's convenient to do that while you have two sides to play off each other, right? If relations completely fracture with the U.S. and then you have Russia, then you can't play that game anymore.
Right, and you just wonder why they don't realize that they've sort of pushed it farther than they should, right? That they derive huge prestige from NATO membership. They derive huge technical expertise. All of their military hardware is NATO military hardware. Why would they jeopardize that over some sort of vague, is it really just a negotiating tactic over patriots? Because if so, it's insane. It's really gone so far beyond what would logically or rationally be sort of makes sense as this playing the two sides off each other, at least in my view.
I think we've just come up with a term with which to study Middle East politics, El Schadenfreude. I'm sorry that I couldn't get to all of you. We're out of time. But in finishing and tying at the ends of what my colleagues have said, a great panel again. Thank you so all for coming, Amanda, Max, and Stephen. I don't think it really matters whether you call Turkey a strategic ally or not. I think the issue is that Turkey is the oldest democracy, if troubled lately, and simultaneously the biggest economy between Germany and India. You can't ignore what happens there. We'll have ramifications not in that space, but also beyond. And so, therefore, one of the conclusions I'm taking from this panel is kind of optimistic that despite everything, there still seems some room for the two countries to diffuse the tensions and come down the ladder. So next Monday is the first day of Eid, known in Turkey and Eurasia as Bayram. It's a time of reflection and compassion for Muslims, so maybe Erdoğan will issue a pardon for Brunson. We'll see. I just made that up. It's not something I've heard. Yeah. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and a round of applause. Yeah.
Hey, you guys, I got to go.